March 15, 1983. Scarface set. Stage 7 at Universal Studios, 11:47 p.m. Al Pacino watches a 22-year-old actress named Sarah Mitchell collapse in tears after their final scene together. What he doesn't know is that his method acting has pushed her so deep into psychological trauma that she'll never act again. 24 hours later, Sarah attempts suicide in her hotel room. This is the role Al Pacino wishes he could erase from history. Not because it was bad, but because it destroyed an innocent person who trusted him. Los Angeles, March 1983. Brian De Palma's Scarface is in its final week of production. The film has already gained a reputation for psychological intensity among the cast and crew. But nobody is prepared for what happens during the filming of the climactic mansion shootout scene, when Al Pacino's Tony Montana meets Sarah Mitchell's character, a terrified young woman caught in the crossfire. Sarah Mitchell was a theater-trained actress from Ohio, 22 years old, making her film debut. She'd been cast as Maria Santos, a minor character with only 3 scenes. An innocent young woman who becomes an unwilling witness to Tony Montana's violence. Her role was supposed to be straightforward: react in terror, deliver 2 lines, survive the scene. But Al Pacino had been living as Tony Montana for 4 months, and Tony Montana didn't distinguish between cameras rolling and cameras stopping. The scene required Tony to threaten Maria while high on cocaine and paranoia. In the script, Tony grabs Maria, puts a gun to her head, and screams accusations about betrayal. Standard movie violence, carefully choreographed, with safety measures in place. But when the cameras rolled at 9:30 p.m. that night, something went wrong. Pacino didn't just perform the scene, he became it. Al grabbed Sarah so hard, he left bruises on her arms, recalls script supervisor Janet Morrison. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was his eyes. He wasn't acting anymore. He was genuinely threatening her, and she could tell the difference. The planned scene was supposed to last 90 seconds. Pacino, fully immersed in Tony's cocaine-fueled paranoia, began improvising threats that weren't in the script. Personal, psychological attacks designed to break Sarah's character down completely. He screamed about her family, her dreams, her fears, using information he'd learned about the actress during rehearsals to make Tony's threats more psychologically devastating. He told me my father would be ashamed of me. Sarah revealed years later in her only interview about the incident. He knew my dad had died when I was 16. Al knew that from conversations we'd had between takes. But Tony Montana used it to hurt me, and Al didn't stop him. De Palma kept the cameras rolling, thinking he was capturing extraordinary raw footage. The crew watched in growing horror as Pacino's improvised psychological assault continued. Sarah's scripted terror became real terror. Her tears of pretend fear became tears of genuine trauma. By minute 6, she was hyperventilating. By minute 8, she was dissociating completely, staring past Pacino with empty eyes. "Cut!" De Palma finally yelled, but Pacino didn't break character immediately. For 30 more seconds, he continued threatening Sarah in Tony's voice while she stood frozen in shock. When he finally released her arm, she collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Pacino looked around confused, as if waking up from a dream, apparently unaware of what he'd just done. "Sarah, are you okay?" he asked in his normal voice, reaching down to help her up. She recoiled from his touch, screaming, "Don't touch me. Don't fucking touch me." The set went silent. Production assistants helped Sarah to her trailer while Pacino stood in the middle of the soundstage, slowly realizing that something terrible had happened. But he couldn't remember exactly what The Tony Montana personality had performed those 8 minutes, and Al Pacino had been a passenger in his own body. Sarah didn't return to set the next day. Her agent called to report that she was indisposed. When production tried to reach her directly, they discovered she'd checked herself into Cedars-Sinai Medical Center's psychiatric wing, reporting symptoms of severe PTSD and dissociation. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the psychiatrist who treated Sarah, documented the damage. The patient presents with acute stress reaction following what she describes as psychological assault disguised as performance. She's unable to distinguish between the actor and the character who traumatized her. Her trust in professional boundaries has been completely shattered. Pacino tried to visit Sarah in the hospital, but she refused to see him. She would have panic attacks when anyone mentioned his name, Dr. Warren noted. In her mind, Al Pacino and Tony Montana had merged into a single threatening entity. She couldn't separate the man from the monster he'd portrayed. The incident was covered up by studio publicists, who reported Sarah's absence as creative differences. Her scenes were reshot using a different actress, and Sarah Mitchell was erased from Scarface as if she'd never existed. But for Sarah, the damage was permanent and devastating. She returned to Ohio and never acted again, abandoning the dream she'd worked toward her entire life. What made the situation even more tragic was that Sarah had specifically chosen acting as a way to heal from childhood trauma. Her father had been an alcoholic who died in a car accident when she was 16. Acting had become her therapy, her way of exploring emotions safely within fictional boundaries. She'd spent 6 years in theater programs specifically because she loved the collaborative, supportive environment where vulnerability was protected by professional protocols. Sarah saw acting as a safe space to explore pain, explains Dr. Margaret Chen, who treated her years later. When Al Pacino violated those boundaries, he didn't just hurt her professionally, he destroyed her primary coping mechanism for dealing with trauma. Years later, private investigators hired by Pacino's guilt-ridden conscience tracked Sarah's life after Scarface. She'd attempted suicide twice in the 6 months following the film. She'd been unable to maintain steady employment because unexpected triggers, aggressive voices, movie theaters, even seeing Pacino's face in advertisements would send her into panic attacks. She'd never married, never had children, never trusted another person deeply enough for intimate relationship. All destroyed her ability to distinguish between performance and reality, the investigator reported. She sees potential threats everywhere because she learned that even in supposedly safe professional environments, psychological violence can be disguised as art. The investigation revealed the full scope of Sarah's lost life. Before Scarface, she'd been engaged to a fellow actor named David Miller. After the incident, she broke off the engagement, convinced that she could never trust her judgment about people again. David waited for her for 3 years, hoping she'd recover. But Sarah's trauma had fundamentally changed her ability to form intimate connections. She told David that if Al Pacino could fool her so completely, someone she'd worked with for weeks, someone she'd thought she knew, then anyone could be hiding violence behind kindness. The investigator documented. She became unable to risk loving anyone because she couldn't trust her ability to recognize danger. By 1995, Sarah was living in a small apartment in Cincinnati, working part-time at a bookstore, surviving on disability payments for chronic PTSD. She'd tried returning to theater multiple times, but each attempt ended in panic attacks during rehearsals. Her dreams of becoming an actress had been replaced by a life of careful isolation and constant vigilance against potential threats that existed primarily in her traumatized mind. When the private investigator contacted her about Pacino's desire to apologize, her response was devastating. "Tell him I still have nightmares about Tony Montana." Tell him that every time I see his movies advertised, I remember what it felt like to think I might die. Tell him that his method acting cost me my entire life." Pacino received this message in his Beverly Hills home and wept for 3 hours. He'd spent 12 years believing that Sarah had simply chosen to leave acting for personal reasons, learning that his performance had traumatized her so severely that she'd lost her career, her mental health, and her ability to function normally was a revelation that changed how he approached every subsequent role. "I realized that method acting isn't just about becoming the character," Pacino revealed in private therapy sessions. "It's about becoming responsible for everything that character does to real people in real moments." Tony Montana threatened Sarah Mitchell, but Al Pacino chose not to stop him. The guilt consumed him for decades and influenced every subsequent performance decision. Pacino began studying trauma psychology, trying to understand how his actions had created such lasting damage. He learned that psychological assault during vulnerable moments can be more damaging than physical violence because it shatters the victim's sense of safety in supposedly protected environments. When someone trusts you enough to be vulnerable with you professionally, and you violate that trust while they're in character, you're not just hurting them as a person, explains Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in performer trauma. You're destroying their ability to use performance as emotional exploration, which for many actors is essential to their psychological well-being. Pacino secretly paid Sarah's medical expenses and living costs through anonymous charitable contributions, but money couldn't undo the psychological damage. He consulted with trauma specialists, trying to understand how his performance had created lasting harm, but the experts were clear: some wounds don't heal, especially when trust has been shattered in professional environments. The financial support continued for decades, covering Sarah's therapy costs, medications, and basic living expenses. But Pacino never felt like money could address the magnitude of what he'd taken from her. Not just her career, but her capacity for trust, love, and professional fulfillment. In 2008, 25 years after Scarface, Pacino made one final attempt to contact Sarah directly. He wrote a handwritten letter taking full responsibility for the incident, acknowledging that his method acting had crossed ethical boundaries, and asking if there was anything he could do to help her healing process. The letter took him weeks to write, going through dozens of drafts as he struggled to find words adequate for the harm he'd caused. "I know that apologies cannot undo trauma," he wrote. "I know that my success came at the cost of your dreams. I know that every award I've won since 1983 is connected to the role that destroyed your life. I can't take back what Tony Montana did to you, but I can take responsibility for my failure to protect you from him." Sarah's response, delivered through her lawyer, was brief and final. "The best thing Al Pacino can do for me is ensure this never happens to another young actress." This response motivated Pacino to become an advocate for performer safety in method acting situations. He began working with actors' unions to establish protocols for intense scenes, requiring psychological safety officers on sets, and creating guidelines for method actors to prevent character work from harming scene partners. He funded research into the psychological risks of immersive acting techniques and lobbied for mandatory training in trauma-informed performance practices. But none of these efforts could restore Sarah Mitchell's lost life or repair the damage done during those 8 minutes in 1983. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation, established anonymously by Pacino in 2010, provides mental health support for actors who've experienced trauma on professional sets. The foundation has helped hundreds of performers, but its existence is a constant reminder of the young woman whose dreams were sacrificed to create Tony Montana's authenticity. Today, at 83, Pacino still receives annual updates about Sarah's well-being through the same private investigators. She's alive, still living quietly in Ohio, still struggling with the long-term effects of that night 40 years ago. She's never married, never had the family she dreamed of, never recovered the trust in other people that Tony Montana's threats destroyed. She works part-time at the same bookstore, reads voraciously, and maintains minimal social contact beyond professional interactions. Every year on March 15th, I get a report about Sarah. Pacino admits, every year I'm reminded that my greatest performance success cost another person everything. That's not a trade I would make again, knowing what I know now. The reports reveal a woman who has found a kind of peace through acceptance rather than healing. Sarah has built a quiet life within the constraints of her trauma, finding meaning in small daily routines and careful connections with a few trusted people. But the life she'd originally planned, marriage, children, a career in theater, remains forever out of reach. The role Al Pacino regrets most isn't Tony Montana. It's the role of Al Pacino, who failed to protect a young actress from the monster he'd created. Sarah Mitchell never got to become the actress she'd dreamed of being. Instead, she became a cautionary tale about the cost of method acting, when empathy fails and ego takes control. Her life was sacrificed to make Tony Montana more authentic, and Al Pacino has carried that guilt for 40 years. The worst part isn't that it happened. The worst part is that for 8 crucial minutes, when Sarah needed Al Pacino to remember he was acting, he chose to stay in character instead. That choice destroyed her life, and no amount of success, awards, or recognition has ever made that trade worthwhile. Some performances cost more than the actor realizes, and some prices are paid by people who never chose to audition for the roles that were forced upon them. Sarah Mitchell auditioned to play a minor character in a movie. Instead, she was forced to play the victim in a real psychological assault that ended her dreams and changed her forever. Today, Al Pacino's greatest regret isn't the roles he didn't get or the awards he didn't win. It's the 8 minutes when he forgot that Sarah Mitchell was a real person, not just a prop for Tony Montana's authenticity. Those 8 minutes cost him nothing, and cost her everything, and that arithmetic has haunted him every single day since.